Hello, friends. Welcome to Talking with Famous People. My name is Host Eric, and I am somebody who talks to people on the internet via YouTube video, as I'm talking to you now. An interesting thing to do, I must say. Most interesting thing I've ever done, in fact. And in the process of determining what makes sense as a media maker, as though if I had 1,000 lives to try it all out, what would I end up doing and being? But all in one life. I have 2,750 videos talking about various things. All the ideas I thought about, talked about, all the people I talked to. How many? I don't know, but it's a lot. It's hundreds, 1,000. I don't know. I don't know. More than that. I have that little concept of exactly how many it is, but I've made a lot of videos. I've responded to a lot of comments, and I've talked to a lot of people. And in the process of doing so, I slowly figured out why I was doing that. It's an odd way to go about it, right? Just do this shit and try to figure out why you're doing it as you're doing it. There were a lot of personal reasons why I did it, a lot of personal needs that I needed to fill. And it has successfully filled many, many gaping holes that previously were in me to be able to engage with all the people that I'm able to engage with, all the famous people, and to have their approval and companionship and friendship is there's nothing more important to me in life than that. And so, with so many needs fulfilled, it's unavoidable that I begin to think about messages, so to speak, ways to define what my position is and what I think, what normative claims I'm making, what ought other people do. It's a it's an almost impossible trail to even begin to head down. What ought other people to do, Eric? Well, how do you know what other people ought to do? You don't exist from their perspectives. And in fact, that's the gist of my message is that individuals are individuals. Talking with famous people is a community of individuals engaging with each other honestly and openly as best as possible. And so my core message is one of discursive responsibility. It says hold yourself accountable discursively and hold those around you discursively responsible and be honest and be fair. Find an environment that allows you to do that. Not everybody can go in and enforce a fair code of discourse. Almost nobody knows what that would look like. The number one underlying foundation of the whole thing is the notion of reciprocal burdens. And beneath that, the notion of the law of non contradiction. But additionally, within the raw room at least, and as I understand discourse, we need to locate, define, acknowledge, and weigh values from other epistemologies that fail on the conditionality plane in which we normally express ourselves. The possibly biggest single cause for human conflict and the biggest single cause for a failure to know better is a failure to respect and understand conflicting epistemologies as equally legitimate, but also a failure to limit those epistemologies in terms of where they ought to make decisions when regarding both the individual and the group. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means. If I am winning on a TI level, so to speak, winning, if the point I'm making stands and the point the opposing person is making does not stand, then the standing point remains standing until knocked over. And the point knocked over remains knocked over until built back up. You could build back up by defeating the point that knocked it down, potentially, or by supporting it from another direction so it doesn't need the thing that got knocked over doesn't need anymore to stand up. Remember, what is the point that's being knocked over and stood up? Really, it's the impact. If I say we should buy that old painting at the yard sale because it's actually, I think it's a highly valuable vintage piece. Well, the impact is it's worth a lot of money. And the warrant is, I think it's a Monet. It's an authentic Monet. Now, if you come over and say, no, look, it's a forgery. I can see this is the indicator right here. It's not an authentic Monet. Then that point is not standing anymore. There's no reason to assume it's worth a lot of money. You've proved that it's a forgery. I've not responded to the fact that it's a forgery. If I say, no, actually, you were tricked into thinking it's a forgery. It actually is real after all, because that forger's trick was part of their authentication process. Who knows what? And then fine. But if you don't do that, then it's a forgery and it's not worth anything, and you shouldn't get it. But then you might prop it up from a different angle. You might say, okay, fine, it's not worth a lot of money because it's the original, but it's still worth a lot of money because it turns out this forgery itself is famous. It was part of a famous art heist in this time period, and therefore it may not be worth quite as much, but it's still worth a hell of a lot more than they're charging for it. And then at that point, that would be the determinant factor, and you'd be correct in saying we should buy the painting, and unless the other person said, oh, actually, that's a forgery of that forgery, something like that, you know. That's the way we all operate in life. When there's something that needs to be determined specifically like that is in fact determinate. The challenges come when we're talking about things that are not determinate, things like normative claims. And the real problem comes because everybody operates as though they weren't determinate, and here I am making claims that in fact they are, and we ought to treat them as though they were. Because, of course, everything is for the sake of given flow. This is a word that everybody ought to know, everybody ought to understand what it means. It means for the duration of a point in dispute, there are sets of arguments made and responses made. Those land somewhere on a piece of paper and continue to exist. We can reference them. They don't change. They are facts and evidence now. You said blah. The work of a conversation is the parsing out of the conditionality web and the elimination of certain possibilities and the promotion of others. But not everybody operates on that conditionality web in all matters at all. Now, I never have a problem with somebody like an introverted feeler coming in and expressing what they like and they value and stuff, and there being potentially contradictions implicit in what they're saying, because they're not attempting to make ground with argumentation. And when people are expressing themselves in ways that do not attempt to make ground in argumentation, that is to say, make claims and have them rendered successfully defended such that they can be referenced again in the future as having been defended in a previous flow, for example. Say, look, we argued that point out in a previous flow. It's been defended. Do you have any new points on it? No? Okay, then it's for the sake of this argument as well, it stands. So let's go forward now. We don't need to go make the same arguments again, repeat that. We already know how that played out last time. The arguments played out a certain way. There's a certain order of operations here, you know? So the thing is, we have to understand that we're not trying to attain an outcome outside of the flow, that it's impossible to get off the flow if you're trying to make ground with your argumentation. If you're trying to make claims and decide things so that we can use that for further points, then you don't get to do that off the flow. It doesn't work any other way. If you get to shift ground and forget about the points you made previously and make new points, and not have to bear the burden of consistency between your points, nor have to bear the burden of the the necessary outcomes of point A, you can just pretend they don't exist, that you can just ignore unintended consequences entirely, then you're not using reason correctly. Reason is designed to eliminate that which is wrong. To the extent that it's used for other purposes, it's used to ill ends. We're not supposed to use TI, introverted thinking, reasoning, conditionality, in order to allow things that aren't okay, in order to allow things that aren't consistent with that model, with that epistemology. TI should not necessarily be the dominant epistemology in all circumstances. Sometimes we should prefer extroverted feeling or introverted feeling or any number of other things. But what I'm saying is that under no circumstances should it ever be okay for TI to prioritize within its own modality inconsistencies, because to do so is to render itself illegitimate as a justification for anything. And the heart and soul of introverted thinking, conditionality, logic, is legitimacy. This is more legitimate because it takes into account factors that we can take into account, logically considers them, and it says we force our symbols for things in the world and experiences in the world to have finite scope so that we are able to deduce things that otherwise we'd have to experience to know. It's important that we preserve, more than that though, the fairness of discourse that occurs when we treat logic first and foremost as a process that enables us to render meanings that are effective and to engage in metacognition and to produce for others sets of meanings that have been rendered for comprehension purposes rather than for personal satisfaction or appetite fulfillment. Understanding the self is a complex business involving a lot of metacognition, and discourse is a hugely important part of that. Being able to talk to others and talk out ideas fairly, freely, without any worries that someone's going to just spoil the soup because they're upset and take the ball and go home, kind of a thing, right? You got to know that whether it's raining or shining, whether it's yelling or whispering, whether it's whatever, that it doesn't matter how how flashy the guy is playing basketball, that if he misses the basket, doesn't get 2 points. He's real flashy, but he missed the basket. He still doesn't get 2 points. Doesn't matter how fancy he looked doing it. And you got to know that's the truth. And you got to know also that just because you're losing by 40 points doesn't mean they're cheating. That's got to be okay too. It also has to be okay to framework out and say, look, this is introverted feeling matter. She's not saying logically this is the case. She's expressing her position on something and her valuings of it. And she's presenting it as a point from which we might build discussion, not making any bold claims here. She's not here to argue. People who aren't here to argue shouldn't have to argue. And there are easy, fair, just, and respectful ways to communicate ideas that don't promote argumentation. There are also ways that you can try to claim new ground and make progress in argumentation. You can't have both concurrently without sacrificing introverted thinking, which is your justification for doing so in the first place. So, that discursive law is what I want to convey to the world more than any other is that we acknowledge the equal weight and validity of other epistemologies besides logic. We have to. And we take our logic and we direct it towards when those epistemologies ought to be applied and in what circumstances. We always remember that the core issue is right or wrong because it's right or wrong about the process. That way we protect everybody's ability to be right or wrong in the moment. That when we fixate on whether or not a person wants to be right or wrong, when we fixate on whether a person has this emotion or that emotion or this display of rudeness or politeness, then we are being distracted from the only thing that can be adjudicated on the conditionality web, which is the meaning of the words. Now, it doesn't mean we can't adjudicate the extroverted feeling matter separately, how you come off, how you display, and whether that was a good idea to approach it that way. But that is a separate matter, and to conflate the two is to violate one of those laws of discourse. The fact that I told you in a way you don't like does not mean you can legitimately respond to what I said differently. My point is, you say like too much, for example. Kato, you say like too much. Eric, you shouldn't have called him out in front of everybody, blah, 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 blah. Occasionally that thing might trump shit. But 99% of the time is, you're the problem. That's the problem. We shouldn't be transparent and honest. We should be scared. We should be scared to have mistakes and flaws as human beings, and to have those addressed and adjudicated publicly, and to try to fix those, and try to be a better person and optimize. We should be scared to do that. No, fuck you. We shouldn't. We should do more of that. All the time. That's how to cure the world of all of its ills. And that is my message here. I have been host Eric, and this has been Talking with Famous People, and my message changes daily, so who knows what it's going to be tomorrow, but that's my message right now, and I really believe that at the end of the day, it's been my message all along and probably always will be. Good, honest, fair discourse is the key to civilization and the future of humanity, along with Eric for President. 2020? Yeah. 2020, I'm going to be your president. Hello, Mr. President. Hello. What we going to do today? We're going to save the world. With what? Discourse.